Hi, welcome to the Med Device Cyber Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Espinoza, along with our co-host, Trevor Slattery. And today we have a guest, Kevin Derr. Kevin is from NeuronSphere. You want to tell us a little bit about what you do, Kevin, at NeuronSphere, and maybe a little bit about your background in the MedTech industry?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, Christian and Trevor. So I've spent the last 20 some odd years working with data. And in the last 16 or 17 years, I've been completely focused in the medical device area. So I started at Stryker, moved on from there to Auris Surgical Robotics, which got acquired by Johnson & Johnson. And then we started NeuronSphere. And when we started NeuronSphere, we decided, or we were trying to give a toolkit to engineers working in the medical device industry, which they could use to develop data products, right? So I spent the previous 10 years stringing together 15, 20, 25 different SaaS companies and systems to make a data platform, and all of the challenges that come with that. And then one of my architects, a gentleman named Brian Green, came to me one day and said, "Hey, I think I figured out how to make this into a product and not make it so specific to a company." And thus was born NeuronSphere. And so in 2020, we broke out of J&J and we started NeuronSphere. And the idea is to give a toolkit to engineers to help them productize their data, develop new AI, ML algorithms for their medical devices, get them out to those medical devices, staying compliant with both cybersecurity and FDA regulations. And that's what NeuronSphere is. It's a toolkit. It straddles the line between SaaS and software. So we don't deploy like a typical SaaS solution. So that is pretty unique to a NeuronSphere deployment. You maintain ownership of your data throughout the life cycle of your data platform with NeuronSphere. And that does a number of things from the security perspective, right? It makes things like BAAs a little bit easier because it's one vendor out of the trust chain, right? But yeah, so that's what NeuronSphere is. In its shortest description, is a toolkit for engineering teams to be able to make good data products, whether it's in R or it's in Python or it's in C++. Like, the language is not so much of a concern to NeuronSphere, because NeuronSphere is about keeping your AWS infrastructure in a state of control, doing things like spinning up resources automatically when you need them. But the idea is to enable engineers to be compliant without having to slow down. So a NeuronSphere install takes less than 2 weeks, and you can be up and running and exploring your data. So
awesome! I think it's interesting. A lot of people that have kind of broken out and started their own organization in MedTech came from, one of these larger companies like Medtronic or Stryker, like you mentioned, or J&J. Trevor, like, from your perspective, we look at protecting the data. With something like NeuronSphere, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, Trevor. What do you see as some of the cybersecurity challenges with data and kind of managing the data throughout the life cycle?
Well, the big one, which Kevin already kind of touched up on, is if you don't maintain ownership of that data, you don't have control of where it is. And if you're sending that into like a hosting provider or something, they might not have the same sort of controls that you would want to implement on your data protection. So having that control over your own data is, I think, a really important point to touch on. And it's really good that you guys have a solution that makes sure that, you're not just giving the data away to someone, they handle it a different way. That's probably one of the bigger concerns that we see from our clients trying to get through the whole cybersecurity process. Is they're a little bit afraid of, oh, well, who's getting this information? Cybersecurity is a sensitive topic. We're giving you guys a lot of sensitive information to build out these packets. Where's it going? What is the FDA doing with it? What is that, static testing tool you're doing? How is that taking our source code? So data management, data protection, IP protection are at the front of everyone's mind, especially when they're coming up with a new product or working for a startup. So it's good to have some controls around that to protect it.
Yeah, it's interesting. If I could jump in there with a little bit of a story, all of my career, whether it was Stryker, J&J, or Oris, one of the things that I struggled with as a purchaser, right? So as a director of whatever I was directing at the point, right? And even middleware back in the day when I was directing the middleware team, right? You always have this conversation as a medical device company with vendors that starts out great. They've got a solution. We've got a problem. The solution gets fixed with the problem gets fixed with their solution. And then it comes time to do your 510K filing, and quality gets involved with the conversation, right? And you start doing things like actually going through the rigorous level of testing that you have to do for V&V. And you figure out that the infrastructure that you're running at this said vendor is not compliant with, 1345, whatever the ISO rule is, 27001, right? And then you go to your vendor and you find out, if you want those controls, you have to go to the medical grade version of this service, right? And then you wind up having to pay a premium. And that was a pattern that repeated for me everywhere I went. And one of the things that Brian and I tried to do with NeuronSphere was solve that. Our solution for that was to just give you ownership. As a customer of NeuronSphere, you own it. You run it in your infrastructure. So if you're 13485 compliant or you're 27001 compliant, you keep your environment that compliant, you're good, right? And you have to do that as a manufacturer anyway. So it really does simplify that portion of running a data ecosystem, running a data platform.
So you're saying that like it solves the challenge. Like if I have HIPAA data and I put it in AWS, there's the normal AWS, which costs a certain amount, but there's also the HIPAA compliant AWS, which costs more, right? So you're saying it solves that challenge.
Yeah, I just don't like your analogy as AWS, because the infrastructure provider is AWS, right? So they are that data center.
Sure.
It would be more akin to like running some kind of distributed airflow environment, and your vendor who's running your airflow environment is, not compliant. Well, here you are, you buy the software, right? When you buy a license from NeuronSphere, you're not just licensing a space in HMD Labs, our company's cloud, right? No, you're buying an install of NeuronSphere that you're going to run in your AWS environment. So there's no BAA that needs to be signed with NeuronSphere, right? Because your BAA is with AWS because they're housing your data. In my past life, I would have a BAA with every vendor that was in that chain, right? And so that's kind of what I'm talking about more. It's not so much solving something with AWS. AWS has a great solution for being HIPAA compliant. Their BAA program is very easy to understand. It's very easy to implement. But it removes one piece of that complexity, being us as the vendor providing the solution on top of AWS, right? So I wouldn't want to set a false expectation that you're not signing a BAA with AWS. You still have to do that, right? You do have to do that. But with NeuronSphere, it's in your ecosystem. It's not in the HMD or the NeuronSphere ecosystem. So it's one step removed, and it's one piece simpler in your trust chain.
So all the cybersecurity controls are up to the organization to implement versus,
yes,
I guess, have them transferred over.
Yeah. So we like to say NeuronSphere is architected to be compliant. Which means that we created NeuronSphere with all of ISO 27001, 1345, and SOC 2 Type 2. All of those types of controls are architected into the NeuronSphere ecosystem. And that way, we try to make it as easy as possible for our customers to be compliant. But with taking ownership of your data with NeuronSphere and controlling your own fate with your data, it also means that you need to make sure that your compliance is held, right? So we can give you the tools, but our customers could still, break the rules. So if you were, right? So I think of it similarly to S3 buckets in AWS, right? The most common vulnerability in S3 is a misconfigured S3 bucket, right?
Yeah, I know that back in the day when I worked for DoD, like the FBI and CIA had misconfigured S3 buckets where you could like
right.
pull out tons of information.
Yeah,
And I'm not an Amazon S3 bucket expert. Trevor probably knows more about that than I do. But is that a common thing we see, Trevor, like with our clients, like misconfigured S3 buckets?
Surprisingly, we don't see it a ton on the SAM, like software as a medical device side of things. When I was doing a lot of bug bounty hunting, on the other hand, yeah, I would just look for any .gov domain, try to find their S3 buckets. And like you said, they're everywhere.
I mean, it also, there was some big news like 8 years ago with some big data breaches that were misconfigured S3 buckets. And a lot of the bigger players, right, the Strykers, the J&Js invested a lot of money in systems to make sure that their teams spread across the world were implementing the controls properly. And so I think in the last 10 years, it's probably come down significantly, but it's the easiest hole to create in your environment, right? Is missing one setting or things like that. And honestly, I've leaned on other vendors very heavily over the last 6 to 8 years to make sure that, that teams don't miss things, right? And things don't fall through the cracks. So there's a bunch of players out there that'll look at your AWS configuration and check it for you. So
I think part of the issue is you only need to make one mistake for someone to get in. You have to fix, 200 different problems. And if you fix 199 problems, you'd think, that's almost perfect, but it's not perfect. If there's one problem, one little chink in the armor, someone's going to find it. There are all these like web scrapers and tools just combing over the internet 5 million times a day, trying to look for those little tiny holes, those little misconfigurations in an S3 bucket. So it's kind of the good guys need to be lucky every time. The bad guys need to be lucky once.
Yeah, exactly. I was on a podcast yesterday and we were talking about standing up an AWS instance, and I've stood them up before. And within like 30 seconds, it's been scanned like 1,000 times by somebody trying to break into it. Like it just came online, right? So I was trying to explain what the landscape is really like. There's all these attacks going on, but we can't see them. But it would be like somebody, like 100 people running through the parking lot and checking every door to see if there's an unlocked car in the parking lot and trying to break in. It's pretty crazy the amount of attacks, non-direct attacks are just propagating incessantly out there.
And I mean, it's been getting worse, and I think it's only going to continue, right? So the tools on both sides of the attacking equation, right? The defenders and the attackers, the tools are just always getting better, and there's always more out there. So we take an approach with NeuronSphere that the standards exist for good reasons. There's been a lot of brain power and a lot of effort by a lot of people to get a lot of those standards in place. And so making sure that your ISO 27001, I know I keep referencing that, but it's a big one, right? Making sure that those controls are in place and working is really all you can do, right? And it really does give you a good sense of protection. And the biggest thing is if or when there is a breach, you have hopefully all of the reporting and all of the tools available to both stop the breach and recover from the breach, right? And that's all you can do in the security space.
I kind of feel like these standards like ISO 27001 or 27002, which I think defines the controls, I think they're like the minimum. I think people think this is all I should do is find some random standard out there and follow it. But compliance is like the bare minimum from my experience. I mean, Target was PCI DSS compliant when they had a hack. All these organizations were compliant with the appropriate body, like SOC 2 or whatever. They still were compromised. So I think it's definitely a good idea to follow a standard or a framework, but you have to go beyond that and think about your environment and how that applies to the environment and what the gap is as well.
Wasn't that Target attack also like a fringe system? Wasn't it an HVAC system that was compromised that let them onto the network?
They did come in through the HVAC system, yeah, an HVAC vendor, yep. But I think their credit card system was also vulnerable. It wasn't on an isolated network, is my understanding. Trevor may know more about that one. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the whole issue is Internet of Things are always, they're kind of in the back burner in anyone's mind for security. But it's really, those are super, super easy ways in. When I was doing a lot of internal penetration testing, 9 out of 10 times, my first foothold in the network was through a misconfigured printer. And they left a default credential or something like that, and then you get domain credentials out of the printer, and then boom, it's game over. Their entire network is toast. And so all of these internet-connected things, HVAC systems, credit card readers, thermostats, refrigerators, TVs, how do you know what that vendor is doing for cybersecurity? If you get some cheap TV off of Amazon, great, you have a $90 flat screen TV, but it connects to the internet and boom, that's, the bad guy's foothold in. So I think there needs to be more awareness around those fringe systems, around these weird components that aren't necessarily just a computer or a server or something people always think of for traditional cybersecurity. You still need to apply it to these Internet of Things.
Yeah, the other interesting aspect that we deal with in medical devices that we don't see elsewhere is, well, I guess you might see it in aerospace or other big controlled systems, but it is the idea that it's not just about your data security. It's about the impact of that data on the medical device and whether or not there is an impact to the safety and effectiveness of it. Right. So we always have to remember that the companies that are building the medical devices are weighing this equation of, heightened security, adequate security versus not impacting or enhancing patient safety and effectiveness. And sometimes in the data space, those things are very separate, right? Because your data has been sucked off to some other system and it's up in the cloud somewhere, or it's on this, service team server for being able to service the devices in the field. But typically that data is not overly sensitive. It's, telemetry, it's motors, heat sensors and things like that. But then you have, mosaic data. And the idea of, well, you can figure out the date and time of a procedure, and you can figure out where the procedure was done. And God forbid there's a doctor's name in that payload, and suddenly you've tripped the HIPAA, the HIPAA threshold or the GDPR threshold, right? And so there is that side of the security trust chain, which is just ensuring that the data is kept safe and secure. And then there's that whole other aspect, which is making sure that whatever you're doing with that data is not impacting the safety and effectiveness, because sometimes the data trips a logic check and the device behaves differently based on that data, right? And that's it's an attack vector that I think the FDA is most concerned about, right? The FDA is more concerned about whether or not the attack vectors are going to have an impact to patient safety and effectiveness, right? It's less about the HIPAA side of things. The HIPAA side of things is more just regulation.
Yeah. You've been in the industry for quite some time. I'd like to get your perspective, Kevin, on, I know the FDA came out and really raised the bar with cybersecurity in September of 2023. Do you feel like the industry is actually progressing in cybersecurity and in data protection? The MedTech, industry is actually progressing.
Oh yeah. I've seen it. I've seen it. I mean, when I started at Stryker 15, 16 years ago, compared to what I saw Stryker doing when I left Stryker 6 years ago, 8 years ago, right? In the 9 years that I was at Stryker, I saw them just invest a huge amount of time, people, and money into this space. Now, that being said, prior to joining the medical device industry, I was in the travel industry. I worked for the Hertz Corporation for almost a decade, where I helped them really digitize their entire business, right? So when I started at Hertz, our goal was to do $1 million of sales a month on the website. When I left 9.5 years later, we were doing like, a couple of $1 million an hour, right? So we went from a fragment of the business to, when I left the business, it was like 40% of the sales were coming through the website, right? I learned more about being compliant with regulations than I ever thought I would have to deal with in a company like a car rental company. I thought, who cares about a car rental company? And then you remember that presidents aren't always presidents, right? And before they're presidents, before they're really famous, they rent cars. And car rentals have things like your social security number, especially in the past, maybe not so much today, right? Credit card information, your home address, your driver's license number. If you travel internationally, it's got your passport information. They have really sensitive information about you. And they invest huge amounts of money in, security and being compliant. The first secure data center I was ever in was a travel industry data center back in like 1999, 2000, something like that. And so, I learned HIPAA at Hertz, right? I learned what the HIPAA rule set was, and I made the HIPAA call center, or I made the Hertz call center HIPAA compliant back in 2003 when the stuff was just getting rolled out, right? So yeah, I definitely feel like the industry is making big strides. I just think that they're slow. And I think that is not a fault of anyone in the industry. I think that is a natural thing that happens when your primary concern is the patient's safety. Your testing, your rigor is all about ensuring that we're not going to kill the patient with our device, right? Or at least that's what you'd like to think. I know that that's the case at the big companies that I've been at. I'd like to think that every medical device company in the world has that mindset as at its core. So are they improving in the security space? Absolutely. Is it taking longer than other industries? Absolutely. And I think that is because of this history that we have of dealing with long submission timelines, right? 510K filings have always been, 6+ month endeavors, right? It's great to see some, pointed examples over the last 5 years of people getting things through in 90 or 120 days, right? But there is a culture in the industry of slow, steady progress and not killing our patients, right?
Right. I'm curious, both your takes on something. As you were talking, Kevin, I agree. I think we're making slow progress, but I think the fundamental issue, if we roll back the curtain, is most medical device manufacturers will outsource their product development to a team of software developers, or they have a team in-house. From my experience, and I'm just curious on both of your takes, software developers do not know how to develop secure code. And they were never taught to develop secure code. So it's like this, until that changes, we're not going to get out of this cycle, in my mind.
So yeah, I generally agree with a lot of what you just said. I do think that, I think that most people who learned how to write code in school and in their first jobs were taught the right ways to write code, which are structured with good comments, nice and secure. And then I think what happens is people get into their jobs, and their jobs have deadlines, and the deadlines become the important thing, and making sure that you don't miss that deadline is the important thing. And all of the other stuff that you learned in school about structuring your code and keeping it secure and making it well documented and all of those things, they become lower priority. And I think that for a long time, we've operated kind of in that guise, and that has allowed, that is always going to allow for a bad actor to find a place to exploit you, right? So my experience has been that while yes, I agree with the sentiment that these engineers just don't know how to write secure code. The schism that I have is that it's less about them not knowing how to write good secure code, and it's just more that they haven't exercised that muscle, for some in a long time. Because I do find that when you like get into the nitty gritty and start talking to them like at a method level about what they did in their code and why they chose to do it this way, they will be like, "Oh yeah, well I could have done it that way and it would have been more secure." They do know it's just not there. It's not their focal point. And so what I've always done with my teams is I always try to make my team's focal point the secure side of the coding practice. Right. And thus I try to inject it into my teams as a almost as a motivation to do well. Right. And then, of course, with NeuronSphere, what we did was we made it a structured framework. Right. So with NeuronSphere, if you code things the NeuronSphere way, kind of like if you adopt our way of thinking, in general, by default, you will be more secure because we've architected into the system that all of the methods and everything that you're doing is structured from a secure and compliant perspective, right? But yeah, I do like it is. I can't tell you how many times I sat down with an engineer and been like, well, why did you do it that way? Like, didn't you think of this vulnerability that you just opened up? And the answer invariably is, it didn't dawn on me. Right. Or there is one other aspect which maybe you were trying to touch on, which is the other aspect that they often fall into is there is I would say, I won't say universal. That's too generalized. But there is a pretty consistent opinion from engineers that I've worked with in the medical device industry that hospitals are secure and we don't have to worry about it because it's going to be at a hospital. Right. I have definitely run into that attitude with engineers, especially if they're engineers coming from like fintech. Right. So like if you bring in a group to manage the system for you that's from fintech or from some other, or God, from advertising, right? A completely non-regulated industry, right? Well, maybe that's an overstatement, but you get my point. Those engineers often they're operating from a point of ignorance. Right. They're coming at it with a false expectation. That's really what it is. They have a false expectation that hospitals are secure or that doctors are secure by, in general. Right. They have to be HIPAA compliant. They're dealing with your medical device data. Of course, they're going to be secure. Right. But at the end of the day, the doctors, they never want to put their password into any system. Right. Anybody who's worked on a medical device that's in an operatory knows that one of the biggest complaints about that medical device in the operatory is that the doctor has to sign on and tell the system who they are when they walk into the room, right? It interrupts their workflow. And at the end of the day, it's about the patient's care to the doctor. It's not about the effectiveness or the use of that device, right?
Yeah. I'm going to touch on something you mentioned and then throw it over to Trevor. I think you touched on a couple of things, Kevin. One is some software developers simply don't know how to do secure code. But the other thing is, you mentioned, and I agree, is these deadlines. Because I used to work and manage a team of software developers when I was a director a long time ago. And we were developing a product and we had like a 6-month time frame. And then the CEO came to me and said, we sold a bunch of the products. Whatever we have done, just package it up and ship it out a month from now. And I'm like, well, we haven't done our security testing. We haven't completed all these things. He's like, I don't care. Just get it out the door. So that definitely comes into play. And then something else you mentioned, it's ironic because Trevor and I call hospital networks hostile networks because we just assume they're compromised. So I'm curious, like, what your take is on what Kevin said, Trevor.
I think the point about doctors having their workflow interrupted by logins is spot on. And the mitigation that doctors usually have. And I mean, anytime you go to a doctor's office or if you're in a hospital for whatever reason, sticky notes with the password stuck on the device every single time. I thought it was funny. Last time I was in and out of a hospital, I had a broken leg. And so I was going back and forth for rehab all the time. And they would, take all sorts of readings and measurements and all that whatnot whenever I'd go in. And I would see like the x-ray machine. It had a login page and there was the password stuck on it. The IP of the x-ray machine was stuck on it on a sticky note. It was on every single device that had some sort of computer built in. And so I think that, in general, just places where a lot of people are interacting with something are going to be insecure. Human interaction is the weak link in security 9 out of 10 times. You look at any reports on how did a breach start for like the MGM breach, that's the famous one that everyone knows about, social engineering. It's always that human connection. And then like 3% of the time, it's a vulnerability in an application. It's very, very slow. It's like a edge device, like a VPN portal or something, or just breach credentials, social engineering. So yeah, in general, networks are not secure. I think even secure networks are not secure. And secure development is a rare skill, and it's not something we see all the time. I don't think we've ever had a device without any vulnerabilities. It just doesn't happen. There are always problems. Developers are always introducing, some small mistakes, but small mistakes can stack up and build to a big thing. The FDA talks about vulnerability chaining, where you see if the combination is greater than the sum of its parts, and more often than not, it is. So and it goes back to the point that I was making earlier. The good guys need to get lucky every time. You need to secure every line of code, which is impossible. And the bad guys only need to find one problem to cause a bunch of damage to a device. So it is a delicate balance. And the fact that having near perfect security, I'm never going to say perfect security, but near perfect security is going to compromise functionality. If you have a device running on an embedded operating system and it's performing some time-sensitive functionality, if you're putting a bunch of agents like CrowdStrike or whatever to make sure that it's safe, make sure there are no breaches, you're going to shut down that functionality. You're going to reduce its workflow. You're going to add time to that functionality. It has to be a balance. And I think that a lot of developers, a lot of manufacturers go too far and miss that balance. And they instead say, make it work, make it fast. And they don't think about security. One requirement for the FDA is you need to have security requirement validation and verification. The amount of times that I've been working with a client, I say, okay, we need to prepare, your security requirement V&V. They say, security requirements? I go, oh man.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's start there.
So you just hit on something that I think ties right into your question before, Christian, and that is that the new FDA guidance that came out a little over a year ago, right? End of 2023. God, it's almost a year and a half at this point. That new guidance, which for a person like me, I was like, I thought that finally was done. Right? Like it was finally done. I thought that could have been ratified 4 years ago. Right? But it's finally done. And one of the biggest things that I'm seeing from that is right towards what you were just talking about, Trevor. It's moving the security conversation up in the NPDP lifecycle, right? So new product development process, NPDP. It's what all the medical device companies follow. There's all kinds of QMS regulations. Everybody knows what NPDP is if you're engineering in the medical device space. The FDA moved the conversation about security up in the NPDP chain. And thus, we're having conversations about how to secure, what are the security requirements, how do the security requirements impact the safety and effectiveness. We're having that conversation a lot sooner in NPDP because for the last 10 years, one of my biggest frustrations has been security is the thing that we'll do right before filing, right?
I think it's still that. I think it's still that way.
But it's getting better. I'm starting to see the signs, right? This guidance injected things like data flow diagrams have to be done with your initial submissions, right? Like all of these ideas bringing the concept of managing your data and doing that securely earlier in the NPDP process is going to have a great effect for us. But you're right, Christian. It's going to take time, right? To my point from before, the medical device industry it's a big ship that turns slowly. It does not turn quickly. But I do see the signs of it changing, and I see the startups that I'm talking to trying to sell NeuronSphere into, right? I'm seeing them talk about security and data so much earlier in their life cycle than they did even 3 years ago, 4 years ago when I started NeuronSphere. Right. Our biggest struggles when we first started NeuronSphere was we'd approach a small to medium sized startup. Right. So not angel invested startup, but like, kind of getting their thing working. Right. Maybe out of bench side testing and into first in human trials, like that size company. And invariably what we were getting the answer on was, oh no, security and data is really important to us. But right now we're very much focused on the product. We're very much focused on our procedure, right? With the new FDA guidance, they have to ask those questions earlier, because to get to that first in human study, they now need to have their data flow diagrams. They need to understand a bit about the security posture of their company and their product, right? And so I do see I see the positive side of that, and I see the change coming. I wish it would go quicker. It would take a lot more investment in the medical device space to go quicker. And I don't see that happening right now in the current environment. But I do think it's changing, and I do think it's changing for the better. And I credit the new FDA guidance with the big turning point on that, because I mean, it's the thing they have to do now, right? They can't push it off till the end, because they won't even get through their bench side testing and into first in human unless they have something thought about in the security space, right? And so I see good signs of hope there, but I agree with you, man. It's been a slog.
What do you think, Trevor? Because I feel like a lot of our clients, and maybe they're kind of like they were developing throughout when the guidance came out, they haven't really adopted this security early on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's even the clients that started developing after the guidance, they're just not necessarily even aware of it. I personally think the FDA needs to set apart a budget to put up billboards in like Boston and Minneapolis to say, hey, you need to deal with this.
In the Bay Area, yeah.
I was going to say in the Bay Area, maybe.
Yeah. You covered those 3 areas, you're hitting like 80% of the medical devices in America. You're good to go.
Yeah, maybe throw in Austin. Austin's an up-and-comer there, right?
Or San Diego. We get a lot of people coming in from there too.
That's true. That's true.
But it's just an issue with, sometimes we'll talk to our clients and the first part of any engagement, we say, okay, this is a list of everything that we need. Here is every little bit of information, every process, description, all this. And a lot of times clients look at it and go, whoa, we have none of that. And we go, okay, well, I know you said you wanted to submit in 3 weeks, guys, but we have bad news. So then it's just a matter of, and on the other side, we do deal with a lot of clients, especially our repeat clients that we've worked with several times in the past. They understand what the process looks like, and they come to the table, they say, hey, we want to submit in 4 weeks, but we already know what information we need. We just need to tailor it, make sure everything looks good. And we go, awesome. All right, let's take a look through this. Let's help, we need to make some tweaks here. This needs to say it like that. But we have the raw information, all those data flow diagrams, architecture diagrams, the security use case views, all that's prepared. So if manufacturers are aware of it from the beginning, I think they would be better about preparing all that information and be more cybersecurity aware. But a lot of the time, they just don't know it's something until their, RA consultant is going through the checklist on eStar and says, all right, now what about your cybersecurity documentation? And then the product owner goes, oh no, all right, we got to find someone fast.
Yeah. I mean, they take an approach of trickle down, right? So the FDA gets the Medtronics and the Strykers and the J&Js and all the big players following the guidance. And it slowly trickles out to all of the people that are not in those big organizations. And the FDA, the general guide is, that you have to comply because you're in the industry. You need to go and find out the guidance, right? They're never going to take out billboards. They're never going to get a budget for that. Right? But your point is like spot on. Like if there was a way to get better outreach from the FDA about these things to the industry, it would be better. And maybe some of us who are trying to get the engineers at those companies to be, more compliant or more secure in their coding practices, we'd have an easier time talking with them because it wouldn't feel so out of left field. Right. And that, the big part that I learned in managing these teams in my first 10 years in the medical device industry, coming from the travel industry where you're working on penny margins and budgets are controlled to the penny because of the penny margins, you have a very different approach to problem solving than when you go into the medical device companies. Especially 15 years ago, it was closer to the heyday of medical device companies, right? But these companies, they have huge margins compared to the travel industry. So it blew my mind coming from the travel industry where we had all of these safety and controls and regulations in place, right? Coming into the medical device industry where I saw none, right? I saw some, but it was nothing like PCI compliance, like implementing Sunshine Act controls after dealing with PCI compliance was like a cakewalk, right? But at the end of the day, the medical device companies have the money to invest in it. They choose not to. That's how I looked at it 10 years ago when I first came into the industry, right? What I learned over time was that the important thing that the medical device companies are looking at, first and foremost, is always the safety and effectiveness of their procedure and what their product is going to do to the human that their product is meant to work on, right? Like that is their focus, and it's good that their focus is there. But it means that these other ancillary things, which are all very important, they all are technically second priority to the patient's health, right? And so you're always going to get a little bit of that, a little bit of that schism between what the company is looking to do, because at the end of the day, the engineer is always going to be thinking about making that procedure better first. And then someone like Trevor or someone like, an ethical hacker that you hire from a company in the middle of Colorado, because so many of them are in Colorado for some reason, right? But you hire some company to do that work for you, and it gets pushed to the end. That's why I like the FDA guidance that came out, because it forced things earlier in the chain. And so I know I'm talking circularly because I think it's all a big pattern, right? It's all a big circle that we'd all like to move faster, but.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I know we're coming up here on time. So Kevin, we appreciate you being a guest on our podcast. I'll throw it over to Trevor for any last words of wisdom for the listeners.
Yeah, I think just, keeping that in mind, like Kevin was saying, shifting it a little bit earlier in the process and just understand the regulations before you go into it. It's exciting to build a new product, but if you mess up, it's going to be really expensive. So know what you have to do the first time. And then, you're not burning through $2 million of extra VC funding that you could have used somewhere else. So know what you need to do it at the right time, at the right phase. And I think security should be done as close to the beginning as you can think of.
Awesome. How about you, Kevin? Any last parting words?
I think that I hope that people hear this conversation and hear the positive side of it, right? I hope that this doesn't come across as too doom and gloomy, but I really do see the positive trend that's happening in the industry. I think that the FDA guidance is the center point, the inflection point, if you will, of the industry really starting to change. I think it's going to take another 2 or 3 years before we really feel it throughout the engineering teams, right? But now I'll give you my plug. Download NeuronSphere's open source components and start looking at the NeuronSphere way of managing your data and your data platform. And I would never make the claim that do it with NeuronSphere and you'll be secure, right? Like what you were saying before, Trevor, I'll never say that it's completely secure. But know that using tools like NeuronSphere, you can build systems that are compliant. Try to make sure that the systems that you're implementing are architected from a compliance posture. It's a really important thing. A lot of people think that those are like fluff words, but they're really not. If the system is architected for compliance from the beginning, it will save you tremendous amount of money to making it compliant for your submission time, right? So, yeah, that's my final thoughts.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.